Good afternoon. This is Judith Johnson, and it's my pleasure to introduce Gail Redberg, who is the CTUIR Tribal Native Plant Nursery grower and manager. That's the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I first met Gail, maybe, I hate to say this, Gail, 2 decades ago when she was teaching in College Place, and she brought volunteers out to one of my riparian restoration sites to help with some work that we were doing. And since then, I have seen her and worked with her at the nursery and appreciated her work a great deal. Gail credits her research of plant-fungal relationships in the ancient forest of the Cascades with her decision to enter resource conservation. Teaching and research continue to drive the following goals: develop strategies for producing robust plants with increased survival capability in natural landscapes, including exploiting natural symbiotic relationships with bacteria and fungi, and to develop protocols for culturally sensitive plants to restore traditional gathering areas in her tribal lands. So her recreations are interests are horses, hiking, cross-country skiing, scuba diving, and enjoying her grandchildren. She has a publication on phylogeny and genetic diversity of bioflora. Well, should have read this earlier. Bridgioporus nobolius mus, inferred using mitochondrial and nuclear rDNA sequences. So the reference to that publication is in your speaker's manual. And I'm sorry, Gail, that I butchered it. Her presentation topics are sizing up the site, selecting appropriate species, developing a timeline, locating plant materials, implementing the plan, and monitoring the outcome. And I look forward to your presentation, Gail.
Gail, you need to unmute yourself if you'll just hit the microphone button.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Judith, for such a surprise. I didn't know you were going to be introducing me, and that's very pleasant to hear your voice again. Well, I certainly don't need to say anything about myself because I think she's covered it. So I'm just going to dive right in. And to begin with, on this
Gail, it looks like you muted again for some reason. If you'll just click that microphone icon and it should stay green. And
are we having issues?
we can hear you now. It looks like it muted for some reason, but as long as that microphone is green, that microphone icon is green, we'll be able to hear you just fine. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'd like to revisit the relationship that ancient cultures had with the lands and the natural resources that the land provided in this area. And since I'm most familiar with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, which were the Umatilla, or are the Umatilla tribes, Walla Walla, and Cayuse. And historically, you can go ahead to the next slide. Do I need to tell you each time, or how will that work? Okay. Historically, these tribes depended on seasonal migrations to utilize the resources of the land, and of course, we all know in this area that salmon returning up to the Columbia and its tributaries were the largest source of protein and most predictable source of protein. as the seasons, as they went through their specific runs throughout the year. And this protein could be dried and stored to help them through severe winters. Between the salmon migrations, the people traveled to the Blue Mountains and beyond, actually into the Rockies, further south and down the river. There was a lot of migration that took place to harvest roots, berries, to do trading, to hunt elk and deer and bison. And to time their journeys, I just recently found this out, which I thought was interesting. They used phenology. So they studied which plants were blooming at the time when the harvest was for these other types of species. Roots and bulbs such as the couch and camas could be dried for the winter. And berries and fruits such as huckleberry, chokecherry were pounded into the venison and the salmon to make pemmican. They also used plants for their structures and shelter. Tules were harvested to make a waterproof insulating covering for lodges, for mats, and for burial coverings. And another example is the hemp dog bane, which was harvested for fiber to make fishing nets and clothing as well. And that fiber was strong enough that they could use it to catch sturgeon. So since that time, the indigenous peoples have had many challenges with rapid changes in society, but they remain guided by the principles of land use and stewardship of that land, and are specifically guided by their first foods principle, which is that clean, cold water, the salmon that are living in those waters, the elk, the bison, and the deer, and the berries and the roots are all given by the Creator as nourishment for the people and must be cared for in order for them to continue on. And the relationship with the nursery in all of this is this next slide with the which includes the river vision up at the top, which is a document that's been produced to guide them in the restoration work that has been done to the rivers. The Umatilla River, a tributary of the Columbia, was without salmon for decades, and it was brought back through the work of the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla and collaborating agencies. And now they've just recently brought back the lamprey eels that had also vanished. So this kind of shows the people, the river vision, the people, the little girl who's getting ready to go out in her little wing dress to collect roots, and the salmon, the mule deer, and the sage grouse. And currently the nursery has been involved in that more recently, but the nursery provides materials for all of these activities and wildlife. So who are we? Next slide. This just shows a picture of some of us who work at the nursery. On the left, we have the ladies that are involved in everything, but I depend on them heavily for seed sowing and transplanting. And we have our potting machine in the center there. And I'm down in the far right corner, since you can't see me and during this talk. Next slide. So our friends include these gorgeous riparian plants. On the left, we have the berries and flowers of the choke cherry. In the center, the Douglas spirea, which is a great plant for places that are a little bit marshy. On the right, the serviceberry and its flowers. And then next slide. We've got the arrowleaf balsam root up on the top left, Oregon grape up top right, bottom left, golden currant, and Douglas maple on the right. And then, actually that might be the vine maple. It looks like it is. I'm sorry. The next slide, snowberry and the elderberry blossom. I thought I had 9-bark, but it looks like elderberry to me. Okay, so now we get down to the title of my talk. We want a shrubbery, and you probably are wondering why I chose that. If any of you ever watched Monty Python, the movie In Search of the Holy Grail, you know that the whole comedic sequence about we want a shrubbery was because they were on this quest to find the Grail. In order to get passage through this certain area, they had to provide a shrubbery. And it couldn't just be any old shrubbery. It had to be put just in these certain exact places. And it's hilarious. It's on YouTube if you'd like to see it. But the 5 questions that we need to think about when we are interested in shrubbery are why, where, when, what, and how. So the next slide, why. Why is it that we want a shrubbery? Is our project focused to stabilize stream banks like we just heard about with as a part of what Dale was talking about, to increase shade, increase insect habitat, all to improve stream quality for salmon? Is it to eradicate invasive species and maintain that space with native plants? Is it just to increase plant diversity and their numbers to enhance the ecosystem of an area? Or provide certain wildlife species with appropriate forage? We've grown bitterbrush for mule deer, which are declining in numbers. To return culturally significant species to the land, which is what we're actively doing at the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla. To create a low maintenance xeric landscape for commercial or residential landscapes. Or maybe you just want to attract pollinators and wildlife to your property, whether it's your yard or the corners of your circle irrigation or hedgerows. Or maybe it's after a wildfire or a flood and we need to stabilize soil and reduce those opportunistic invasive. There's probably many more reasons why we want to plant native plants, but these are some of them. Next slide. So where? I mean, after you kind of decide, okay, what is my goal here? Then where is this going to happen? So that involves some gathering of some information from your site. And first of all, these are some questions that I ask prospective nursery customers. What is the latitude and the elevation of your site? That makes a big difference as far as species selection and also seed source. How much precipitation, what's the temperature, wind exposure, all of those things can have a dramatic effect on what types of plants can grow there. How high is the water table? Like we've been talking about, incised streams cause drastically reduced water tables and it becomes difficult to utilize that land. So we've got to be able to get, if you're going to be putting cuttings in, they have to be pounded clear down to that water table. What is the aspect? Is it on a slope? Is that slope facing the south, east, north, or west direction? It depends. That will limit some kinds of plants. Is there any available shade, man-made or natural? What's the soil composition? Does it drain well with a lot of particulates in it, or is it a heavy clay? And what is the soil depth? First project we ever planted on, I didn't even know there was soil in all of the compacted cobble until the rains came and you could finally see a little bit of it. But that really impacts your choices. And is there any available irrigation, even if it's just for the very first or the first 2 summers? Next slide. When is it that you want to be able to plant? And I know that a lot of projects have a great deal of infrastructure that has to take place first. And that time period, I've learned over the years, can fluctuate quite a bit from what originally is planned, depending on permitting and all kinds of flooding, all kinds of other things that can delay projects. But we need to, one of the things about installing native plants that people need to recognize is that if you want to install something that's going to be appropriate for your site, it really needs to be seed sourced to those conditions. And so we're talking generally at least 2 or 3 years before those plants can be ready to install. So how much time do we have to get that done? I do have customers that will call me who have just gotten a bid and that the project will be in a few months. And fortunately, much of the time I've been able to find material either from our nursery or other nurseries, but that doesn't give you the most successful planting. When will a contractor be available to plant if you're going to have it planted by a contractor? When will the desired plants be available? And I mean, how long does it take for the particular ones you want to grow to the size you need? What time of a year will you be planting? There are people who are very convinced that a spring planting is the best time, but for many sites, a fall planting is better because it gives you that opportunity for the roots to really develop before the summer drought comes. And then, you know, are these plants going to be planted time of day? Are they going to be planted when it's cool or in the heat of the sun? Next slide. So what kind of plants are you going to be using? And when I say kind, I'm not talking about species, I'm talking about stock types. So are you going to be broadcasting seed? Are you going to be putting in cuttings, bare root plants, or containerized plants? And each of these types of stock have advantages and disadvantages. They are listed in order of expense from the least expensive to the most expensive as far as the initial cost. But the hidden costs are more difficult to calculate, such as, you know, replacement and the numbers that you have to use in order to be able to get a good planting. What species are suitable to the site? One of the things that I've frequently seen is that a company who is developing the construction plan will also develop a planting plan, and frequently those companies are located on the west side of the Cascades. And so their planting plan will include plants that don't do well here. So it's good to have somebody who, if that's not your area of expertise, it's good to have somebody check that out so that you're not planting plants that are not appropriate to your site. And what kind of equipment will you need to get this all done? Okay, so I just love this little picture of seeds. Seeds are fascinating to me, and they hold so much promise and so much diversity that I just think they're miniature miracles, especially when, you know, everything that can go wrong does, and yet you still get plants, and somehow they manage to produce something. So, and one of the things that's the most valuable about seed is that they have all of the genetics of that plant. When you have a large amount of seed across the board, you're gathering from many different plants, you're getting all of the genetics that are available to that species in that area. This is just a picture of us collecting seed. The one on the left is a serviceberry plant, which is ginormous, down along the railroad on the reservation. And so when people ask me how large plants grow, certain species, that really varies. This particular, I wouldn't normally think that serviceberry would like to be so exposed because it seems like it usually enjoys a little more shade, but it produces abundant berries. On the right, we just have collecting up along the South Fork of the Umatilla, some 9-bark there and ocean spray in the background. And then the other type of, the second type was preparing cuttings. Cuttings are normally harvested when the plant has gone dormant for the winter. I think that the largest reason for that is because for ease of storage, and you can get them ready when you need them. Because you can also make cuttings from softwood cuttings or semi-hardwood cuttings. And so those are at different times of year. They require a little more work than the hardwood cuttings, but they do just as well. Okay, so how will you acquire the plants? And how will you install the plants? How will you reduce invasive species from encroaching? And how will you reduce herbivory? And those are all things that you want to plan out from the beginning. How you will acquire them depends on what type of stock you plan on using in the first place. How you will install them might depend on your project size. People have utilized volunteers, they've utilized inmate crews, and also or contractors with large crews, planting crews, or they've just planted them all with their own personnel. And there's considerations with all of those. How you will reduce invasive species is, that is fraught with issues. So, but I think one of the most important things is to get plants into the ground, some type of plant in the ground before the invasives can take over. And how will you reduce herbivory? And I had a habitat manager who wanted a tree large enough that the beavers wouldn't eat it, and I kind of had to chuckle because I've seen those. I've seen those big cottonwoods that are 2 feet through, and the beavers have chewed them almost in half. The next slide just shows us outplanting, This is this is a project that we've been working on at the Roaring Springs Ranch, which is a huge ranch down in the Catlow Valley, near south of Burns, about 70 miles south of Burns. And it's we're planting there at about 5,000 elevation in the spring. And we had squalls every 15 minutes of snow and hail coming through. It was quite the experience. And that particular project is for a sage grouse, to reestablish sage grouse leks there, which are their breeding grounds. So the next slide, success with native plants. It's never too early to start planting. And one of the things that's really helpful for nurseries and for your project is if you start communicating with nurseries as soon as you can. We really don't mind if you call us up later and say, I'm sorry that project, we weren't able to get whatever happened. It's no longer happening. I would much rather that occur than people wait until they have all of their ducks in a row before they contact us, because then we don't have time to grow the plants that they need. And ask questions. Nursery growers and managers, many of them have been in the business for a long time, have had lots of experiences with people doing riparian plantings, and can give you much good advice. As your plan develops, keep the nursery in the loop. And after you've made an order, update the nursery with any changes that you might have as far as numbers. And every nursery is different. We don't charge a deposit, and we don't charge extra for changing orders. We will charge for storage if someone isn't able to plant all their plants in the fall and we have to keep them for another year, then we do charge a storage fee for that. And give advance notice before picking up your plants, or if that's how you're getting your plants, because frequently everyone is planting at the same time, and so it's good to be able to schedule who's going to come when to make that happen. And we like to get your plants ready. We go out into the area where they're growing and select the very best, most robust plants for each customer, and make sure that they are, well weeded and appropriate. Just a picture of Marie, who's been at the nursery probably one of the longest of any of our employees, working with the sagebrush. The container that those sagebrush are growing from is a 10 cubic inch cone. So it's really good for certain kinds of projects. We've found that it's not very good for cobbly substrate because it just doesn't have enough soil mass to provide enough moisture for those plants till they get their roots established. On the right, just have a picture of some of our water-loving plants we grow in ebb and flow pools. So they're being watered from the bottom. And those are in our tree pot, which is a 4-inch square up at the top, and it's 14 inches long. So that is much better for the cobbly substrate because it provides a lot of soil mass and it gets those roots down 14 inches deep. However, sometimes if your bedrock is too high, then you can't dig a deep enough hole. So those are all considerations that you need to make when you're trying to select your containers. Okay, so the next slide is just some more views of inside of our greenhouses and across the pot field. When this customer was the Legrand habitat or Grand Ronde habitat group, and they come and get several truck and trailer loads of plants. It was just one day when we're saying goodbye to the friendships we've made with those plants that we've struggled over. And then finally, just, you know, I guess the reason I like this slide is because it makes me think about no matter how many times you have a crop failure or a project failure, with plants, there's always a new season. And so we always get do-overs. So are there any questions?
So Gail, I'm going to read you the questions that have come in so far.
Okay.
The first two are saying how much they love the Monty Python reference, and I agree. And the next one is, have you considered planting in November, December, and January? I found that to be very successful, from Key McMurray.
That actually is when I believe all of our habitat managers are on that planting schedule now, except for the forestry department. They still plant their conifers in the early spring, and we don't grow those conifers. We leave that to the conifer nurseries that are specialized for that. But we found that with the riparian work, that's absolutely correct, at least for our area, that the fall planting is the best.
Thank you. So the next question is, how do you reduce in-transit plant damage on long trips to the site?
Oh my gosh, I had a really bad experience. I was transporting some plants and I had a tarp over the trailer, but it didn't fit correctly and that it wasn't quite long enough. And it whipped all the leaves off of those plants by the time I got to where I needed to be. So in transit, transportation can be a real issue. Most of our habitat managers have either a covered trailer or they have one that they can tarp, or they are transporting when the plants have already gone dormant. So the wind isn't as much of an issue.
Okay, the next question is, are there pros and cons to growing seeds in a nursery versus planting seeds directly on the restoration site for grasses or other plant types?
I think that for grasses, this question, okay, I'm glad they asked, are there pros and cons, because there is so much variability. It really depends on the site. It's not, if your main concern is, let's say it's after a wildfire and you have got to get that soil stabilized or you're going to lose all your topsoil, then you do whatever is quickest. And I would say that for most sites, that is growing by seed. The disadvantage to that is that your germination rate may or may not be very high, so the results may be really spotty. But it just all depends on the situation and what your needs are. And frequently people will do a native grass planting first, and then they'll come back in with shrubs. And their plan for that is that the first year they put in the native grass seed, and then they can actually spray a broadleaf spray over that, and which will not damage the grasses, but will get rid of the invasive species. And then they have less, because once you install your shrubs, that you really can no longer have that tool to your advantage. So then all you're really doing is spot spraying or or hand pulling for invasives. I'm not sure if I covered everything in that question.
It sounds, I think you did. So we have several more questions.
Okay.
Any tips for creating your own growing medium or soil so that it's weed free?
Well, there are a couple of things that you can do. If you have space that you can spread it out and cover it with plastic, I think there is information available on that, and I don't remember exactly the time period, but I think that within just a few weeks, well, I know that when we sterilize pots, we can do that. So we can get temperatures high enough to kill, disease-causing organisms. So that's even higher than what you need to kill weed seeds. I don't know the time period, but I would look up solarization for weed eradication. So that's one option. We actually aren't faced with that because we have a steam boiler and a wagon, a steam wagon that we put all of our soil in when we reuse it. But basically, you just want to get your soil hot enough so that you're going to be killing weed seeds. Sometimes a compost pile will achieve that if you take temperatures on your compost piles. I don't know if this person is talking about a home, like a small amount of soil they're going to be needing, or it's not practical for us to be able to do that with the volume that we deal with, but it might be for somebody who's doing a much smaller production.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, have you had any luck propagating tule?
Yes, it's very easy to propagate. So there, I have given out, I emailed some handouts. One of them has just different resources. And I think two of them are different resources. One specifically for pollinator plants, and the other one is for propagating all kinds of plants. And it also has a list of nurseries in this region, native plant nurseries. It's not all inclusive, but anyway, it's a good start. So with propagating tules, or propagating any plant, my very first resource is the Native Plant Network. And that is on both of those resource sheets. You can just Google it, Native Plant Network, and it will come up. And then you just follow the steps for protocols and choose, there's a window, drop-down window, and you can choose the species. You need to know the scientific name of your species before you do it. Tules is Scenoplectus acutus. But anyway, and whenever I don't know a scientific name, I just Google the common name and find a source I trust, and that's pretty easy. And they will have protocols, but generally with rushes, we soak the seeds in water for quite a long time, a few days, and they have to have fairly warm temperatures to germinate. So June is a good month, but they grow really fast. And you can either grow them, we've done it in two different ways. We've grown them in tanks, and that had some real difficulties because all of the roots grew out of the cones and meshed together. We had a mat of roots that was about a foot thick underneath the ends of the cones. But the other way you can grow them is just on a table in cones. They don't have to be submerged in water, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You just need to keep them well watered.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are there species that you've tried but just don't work as a restoration species?
I think that all depends on the site. I can't think of anything that doesn't work anywhere, but I don't have, experience with all species of plants. So it could be that there are some that are just, one of the things we usually look for in restoration plants are things that will grow fairly rapidly, reproduce pretty rapidly, but unfortunately that we get these suite of plants that we typically use, and then the rest of the plants that should be on the landscape aren't there. So I guess I would just have to say I can't think of any native plant that is not suitable for restoration.
Okay, thanks. So the next one is a comment and a question. It's great slide title on your seeds slide. Is that your original quote?
I think so. I read so much, I don't ever know what's mine or whether it's something I read, but anyway.
Okay, next question. Do you grow all of your tall 1 gallon riparian species in the ebb flow cells?
No, and that's a really good question. We started out doing that, and then we found that there are some plants that just don't do well with that. I think it takes them too long to pull the water out of the soil. Some plants they're just, their photosynthesis activity and respiration going on in their roots is just slower, and so they don't do well in that situation. So we no longer grow service berries in tall pots. 9-bark does really well, so do choke cherries, willows, cottonwoods, red osier dogwoods. Alder, yes, alder, but with alder you have to be careful that you don't that you separate them out, because their leaves are so large that you'll end up with quite a bit of death in those boxes of 9. So we separate those out so that they can all get equal sunlight. That's pretty much what we do in tall pots.
Thank you. Any particular plants to help compete with the invasive reed canary grass?
You guys are asking me all the impossible questions. Oh my gosh, reed canary grass, that's the devil. I do not know. I do not know of a plant that competes well with it. I think it's one of those plants that it requires, I think, a multitude of strategies that you just keep throwing at it, and then eventually it gives up. But yeah, I don't know of any of it. If anybody knows of how to get rid of reed canary grass, that would be the time to chime in.
Well, there is a comment here that someone said they'd read that spirea is a good competitor.
It could be. I mean, it does grow really rapidly, and it likes the same environment. I don't believe that it grows from rhizomes, though. Maybe it does. It might grow from, I would have to look that up. Any plant that has that strategy of reproduction is is much more difficult. I mean, much more difficult to eradicate is if they can grow by sending out rhizomes, then it's tough, as well as seed.
Okay, then we have a couple of more comments. Rhizomatous species tend to do well, as do trees, shrubs that will eventually create shade. Canary grass is shade intolerant. And coyote willow can compete best with grass sod mats of all willows. And then there's a reference that's in the chat box for Julie Vanderwall. And then there's another contact here as well. But because we're very nearly out of time, I just want to remind people that you can include Gail and any other presenters who would like to send them handouts in the box folder along with recordings for the symposium. So I think that's pretty close to have about 30 seconds. The final comment is contact Jill Silver. She's from the Olympic Peninsula. She's at the 1000-Year Institute. She's the invasive plants queen.
Cool.
Yeah. So thank you, Gail. That was great. Really appreciate it.
I just want to say one real quick thing is that
Sure.
when I was looking at Dale's slides of the plants that all disappeared in my very first year at the nursery, we planted 9,000 plugs of tulies in the Snake River, and they were all gone by the next spring. And I just thought, ever since then, I've been thinking about how to change that. And there's a nursery in eastern Idaho that makes sedge mats, and I really want to start doing that at the nursery. So they would be something that, the way I conceive it is, you have the soil and seeds infused in like a coir mat. You grow it on a ditch fabric, and then you're able to just cut it, or you'd cut it beforehand, because these would be heavy, probably 2 foot squared, all you could handle, and then stake them into your string bank. And I think that I mean, you wouldn't be able to do that right before a big flood event, but if they had an opportunity to grow into that stream bank a bit, they have really strong roots. So anyway, it's a thought.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you, Gail. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask them, and hopefully Gail can stick around to the end, and we can take more questions. We're going to go ahead